The well at the edge of Caldwell, Kansas had not spoken to Charles Ford in 3 years. Not really, because nothing had spoken to him in 3 years. Not the wind off the plains, not the sunrise bleeding orange over the flat horizon, not even the occasional greetings of men who had once called themselves his friends. And yet on a Tuesday morning in the September of 1878, a woman said 4 words to him that cracked something open in his chest he had been certain was sealed shut forever. He had ridden into town before dawn, the way he always did. Caldwell was a cattle town, a border town, a place where the Kishom Trail breathed its last dusty breath before the herds were counted and loaded and sent east on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. Charles knew the rhythms of the place the way a man knows his own heartbeat, not consciously but deeply, the way knowledge lives in the bones rather than the mind. He came for flour, sometimes for salt, occasionally for ammunition, and he came early because early meant fewer people, and fewer people meant fewer questions, and fewer questions meant he could go the whole morning without having to speak a word to a single soul. His ranch sat 7 miles southwest of town, a modest spread of 312 acres that he had built with his own hands alongside his wife, Margaret. They had come to Kansas from Missouri in 1871, newly married and full of the kind of hope that only the very young or the very foolish carry with them. They were neither young nor foolish. Charles had been 28 and Margaret had been 26, but they had been hopeful in the specific way that love makes people hopeful, as if the future is a country they are traveling toward together and the journey itself is the joy. Margaret had died of typhoid fever in the autumn of 1875. She had been gone for 3 years and 7 months, and in all of that time, Charles Ford had not spoken a meaningful word to a single woman. He was not proud of this. He was not even particularly conscious of it for most of the time, the way a man with a broken arm eventually stops noticing the cast. The absence had simply become the shape of his life. He spoke to his ranch hand, a weathered Mexican man named Rodrigo Salinas who had been with him since the beginning and who never asked him how he was feeling. He spoke to the cattle. He spoke to his horse, a big gray gelding named Copperhead, who listened without judgment and expected nothing in return. He spoke to no women, not Mrs. Hartley at the general store, whom he paid in exact coins, passed directly across the counter without comment. Not the wives of neighboring ranchers who sometimes waved to him from their porches as he rode past. Not the woman at the telegraph office. Not the boarding house keeper who had tried twice to invite him to Sunday supper. He was not rude. He tipped his hat. He nodded. But words, the simple currency of human connection, those he withheld from women entirely, because Margaret had been the only woman whose voice he had ever truly needed, and speaking to others felt like a kind of betrayal he could not fully articulate even to himself. He pulled Copperhead up to the well that stood at the south end of Caldwell's Main Street, the old stone well that the town had built in 1872, and that served travelers and townspeople alike. It was barely 6 in the morning, and the street was quiet, the saloons dark, the general store shuttered. He looped Copperhead's reins over the iron ring on the well's crossbeam and began to draw water, working the handle in the slow, methodical way of a man who has no place urgent to be. He did not hear her approach over the sound of the creaking rope and the splash of water below. He only knew she was there when she spoke. "You look like a man who is trying very hard not to be seen." He stopped cranking. He stood perfectly still with his hands on the wooden handle and his hat brim pulled low and the early morning light just beginning to turn the dust of the street a pale gold. The voice was low for a woman's voice, not mannish but settled, the kind of voice that had learned to carry across distances without losing its warmth. He turned. She was standing perhaps 6 feet away with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a look on her face that was not quite a smile and not quite a question but somewhere in between. She was, he guessed, perhaps 30 or perhaps a little younger. It was difficult to tell in the early light. Her hair was dark brown, pulled back practically under a hat that had seen better days. Her dress was plain, a dark blue cotton, travel-worn but clean. She had the look of a woman who had been on the road, not the desperate, hollow look of someone running from something, but the specific fatigue of someone who had been moving toward a destination for a long time and had not quite arrived yet. He stared at her for a moment too long. She did not seem to mind. "The water," she said, nodding at the bucket he had not yet finished drawing up. "May I use it after you? I have been walking since before sunrise, and I believe my throat has turned to leather." Charles Ford opened his mouth. This was, in itself, unusual. For 3 years and 7 months the machinery of his voice had been reserved for Rodrigo and for cattle and for a gray horse, and now he was standing at the Caldwell well at 6 in the morning with a strange woman looking at him with patient, clear brown eyes, and something that had been locked in him turned, not broke, but turned, like a key in a lock that has not been used in a very long time. "Of course," he said. His voice came out rough, like a door scraping open over gravel, and he was embarrassed by it, embarrassed by the roughness and embarrassed by the warmth that followed the roughness. "Let me get it up the rest of the way." He cranked the handle and brought the bucket up and set it on the stone lip of the well and stepped back without another word. He told himself it was courtesy. Any man of decent breeding offered water to a woman who was thirsty. It meant nothing beyond that. She thanked him and drank from the ladle she pulled from her bag, a practical woman who carried her own ladle, and then she refilled it and drank again, and sighed the long sigh of someone who has been uncomfortable for a great while and has just briefly been relieved of it. When she lowered the ladle she was looking at the town around her, at the shuttered buildings and the empty hitching posts and the quiet street. "Is this Caldwell?" she asked. "It is," he said. She nodded slowly. "Then I have arrived at approximately the right place, give or take a few complications." He did not mean to ask. He had not intended to form the question or open his mouth or engage further, but something about the phrase "give or take a few complications" caught in his mind the way a splinter catches in a fingertip. "What complications?" She looked at him, and now her expression was clearer, and it was a rueful half-smile. The expression of someone who has rehearsed telling a story in their head and is not sure yet whether the person they are telling it to will be sympathetic or dismissive. She said, "The kind a woman collects when she travels from Abilene to Caldwell in a mail wagon that breaks an axle 40 miles out and leaves her to walk the remainder with a bag that gets heavier with every mile." "That is a significant walk," he said. "I am aware," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He was aware of Copperhead watching him with one brown eye, the horse's expression as flat and unreadable as always. He was aware of the sun coming up properly now, painting the front of the buildings in amber. He was aware that he was talking to a woman, actually talking, not simply exchanging the minimum coins and nods required to conduct commerce, and that his heart was beating at a rate that was slightly elevated above its usual quiet rhythm. "Are you meeting someone in Caldwell?" he asked. "I was supposed to," she said. "I have a letter of arrangement with a man named Horatio Briggs who owns the Briggs Mercantile on this street. I was hired to keep his accounts. He wrote to me in Abilene after I placed an advertisement in the Abilene Chronicle saying that I had experience in bookkeeping and was seeking employment westward." She paused. "I did not mention in the advertisement that I was a woman. I have found it is better not to lead with that particular detail when seeking employment in the cattle territories." Charles absorbed this. It was a pragmatic and somewhat sad observation, and it was also, he recognized, the kind of pragmatism that a woman alone in the West had to develop simply to survive. Margaret had had that quality too, a clear-eyed understanding of how the world worked combined with a determined refusal to be entirely governed by it. He pushed the thought of Margaret down. He did it the way he always did, firmly, with both hands, as if he were pushing a cork into a bottle. "Briggs is a fair man," he said. "He will likely honor the arrangement when he sees the quality of your work." "And if he does not?" she asked, not bitterly but with genuine curiosity, as if she were asking what the weather usually did in October. "Then you will find someone else who needs good accounts kept," he said, surprising himself again. "Caldwell has 12 businesses. Half of them cannot balance a ledger to save their souls." She looked at him with something that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "That is more than I expected anyone to say to me this morning." He suddenly felt the heat of his own unusual loquaciousness and stepped back slightly, reaching for Copperhead's reins. "I should be getting on." "Of course," she said. "Thank you for the water," he nodded. He had one foot in the stirrup when she said, "I did not get your name." He hesitated. The stirrup creaked under his boot. "Ford," he said. "Charles Ford." "Eudora Thatcher," she said, and she said it the way people say their names when they have had to say them a great many times to a great many strangers and have learned to make the saying of it sound clear and honest rather than defensive. "Thank you, Mr. Ford." He rode out of Caldwell without looking back. He rode the 7 miles home to his ranch in the early morning light with Copperhead's hooves steady on the packed earth of the trail, and the September air cool enough to make his breath show in small clouds. He unloaded his flour and his salt. He ate his breakfast, which Rodrigo had left on the stove in the way Rodrigo always did, quietly and without fanfare. He did his morning chores, checked the fence line in the south pasture, watched the cattle graze in the long golden light. And all day, like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples of that conversation kept moving outward through him. 4 words: "You look like a man." Not even the most important 4 words she had said, which were, he supposed, the ones about the mail wagon and the broken axle and the 40 miles, but the first 4, the ones that had broken the silence. "You look like a man who is trying very hard not to be seen." He had not known until she said it that he was. He lay in bed that night in the dark farmhouse, in the room where he still slept on what had been his side of the bed, still, 3 years and 7 months later, and he stared at the ceiling, and he thought about Eudora Thatcher and her dark brown hair and her practical ladle and her rueful half-smile, and he felt guilty about thinking about her, and then he felt guilty about the guilt, because Margaret would not have wanted him to feel guilty about anything. Margaret had been the most generous-hearted person he had ever known, and she would have liked the description of a woman who carried her own ladle and walked 40 miles before breakfast. He fell asleep thinking this, which was the most comfort he had felt in a long time, and he was almost angry at the comfort, because comfort implies the possibility of more comfort, and more comfort implies the possibility of hope, and hope, he had decided 3 years and 7 months ago, was a luxury he could not afford. He was back in Caldwell the following Friday. He told himself it was for nails. He did need nails. He had a fence section in the north pasture that had been bothering him for 2 weeks, and he needed nails and probably new wire. He told himself this with such conviction that he almost believed it, and he rode into town at his usual early hour with his usual deliberate pace, and his hat pulled low. He went to the Briggs Mercantile first. He had been going to the Briggs Mercantile for 6 years. He knew the layout of it, the smell of it, the way the floorboards creaked near the back where the tools were kept. He knew Horatio Briggs, a stout red-faced man of 50 who drank too much coffee and told the same 3 stories about his time driving cattle north from Texas in the 1860s. He liked Horatio well enough. He had never in 6 years paused at the front counter beyond the time required to state what he needed and pay for it. He paused this time. Behind the counter, where previously there had only been Horatio Briggs himself or his teenage nephew, there was now a woman seated at a small desk that had been wedged into the corner between the counter and the back wall, a desk covered in ledger books and papers arranged in a way that suggested genuine organizational intelligence. She was writing in one of the ledgers with the focused, slightly frowning expression of someone performing arithmetic they are not yet ready to be interrupted from. It was Eudora Thatcher. Charles stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was strictly natural and then walked to the counter where Horatio appeared from the back storeroom looking harried. "Ford," Horatio said, "what do you need?" Nails, Charles said. 2-inch and 3-inch, and I need to look at your wire. Back left, Horatio said, jerking his thumb toward the back of the store. Miss Thatcher, do you have those October numbers yet? I will have them by noon, said the woman at the desk without looking up. He hired her, Charles said, meaning to think it and somehow saying it aloud. Horatio looked at him with mild curiosity. Met her on the street Monday. She had walked in from the mail road, and she had a letter I sent in June, and she had clearly read the whole thing and understood the accounting situation I described without me having to explain it twice. Of course I hired her. He shrugged with the practical philosophy of a businessman. She asked for $40 a month and a letter of reference at the end of the year. I've had men in here asking for $60 who couldn't tell a debit from a fence post. Charles went and looked at the wire. He selected what he needed. He brought it to the counter with the nails. He paid. And as Horatio counted his change, he looked at the corner desk and found that Eudora Thatcher had looked up from her ledger and was looking at him with the same expression she had worn at the well, not quite a smile, not quite a question. Mr. Ford, she said. Miss Thatcher, he said. He took his change and his goods and he left. He came back the following Tuesday for salt because he had misjudged how much he had. He came back the Friday after that for coffee. He came back the Tuesday after that for horseshoe nails, which he genuinely did need. Each time he went to the Briggs Mercantile. Each time Eudora Thatcher was at her corner desk. Each time they exchanged a few words, more words than the previous time, like a river that is cautiously deepening. The Tuesday of the horseshoe nails was the day she asked him about his ranch. You come in quite often for a man who lives 7 miles out, she said. She was not looking at him. She was writing in a ledger. But she had spoken to him voluntarily, which felt significant in a way he was not entirely ready to examine. I have been running low on things, he said. She glanced up. The rueful half-smile was back. Or you have a very inefficient system of inventory management. He almost laughed. He felt the shape of a laugh in his chest, felt the muscles that would form it and stopped before it happened, startled by the nearness of it. It had been so long since he had laughed that the almost laugh felt foreign, like using a hand you have kept too long in your pocket. My ranch hand Rodrigo would agree with you, he said instead. What is your ranch? She asked, and so he told her. He told her about the 312 acres, about the cattle, about the well on the property that was better than any well for 5 miles in any direction, about the north pasture that flooded in the spring and the south pasture that had the best grass he had ever seen. He told her about Copperhead. He did not tell her about Margaret. He was careful about that, the way a man is careful about a wound that has not fully healed, keeping it covered, keeping it away from things that might make it hurt. She listened the way certain people listen, with a quality of attention that feels like a gift, asking 1 or 2 small questions that showed she had heard what he said and was turning it over, considering it. Horatio Briggs came out of the back storeroom at some point and looked at both of them and went back into the storeroom with the expression of a man who has correctly understood something and is choosing to say nothing about it. Charles left with his horseshoe nails and a feeling in his chest that he identified, after a period of careful and somewhat alarmed reflection, as something that was not quite happiness but was related to it, was adjacent to it, to use the word she had used. He did not trust it. He had not felt anything adjacent to happiness in 3 years and 7 months, and he was reasonably certain he no longer deserved it, and he was completely uncertain what to do with it. Rodrigo noticed the change before Charles was willing to admit to it. Rodrigo Salinas was 52 years old and had worked cattle for 30 of those years, first in Sonora, then in Texas, then gradually north along the trail until he had ended up in Kansas working for a quiet, sad American man who paid fair wages and never asked questions about where a man came from or what he had left behind. Rodrigo had his own sorrows. He kept them, as Charles did, in the locked internal spaces that a person eventually learns to manage if they intend to keep working and keep eating and keep drawing breath. But Rodrigo was perceptive. He had survived on perception. It was his most useful skill. He noticed that Charles was going to Caldwell twice a week instead of once a week. He noticed that Charles came back from town with a particular expression that was not quite the closed, blank look he usually wore. He noticed that Charles ate his supper more slowly in October, as if his mind was somewhere else, and that he had stopped going to bed immediately after dark, instead sitting on the porch in the cool night air looking southwest toward the direction of Caldwell. One evening, Rodrigo came out to the porch with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Charles without being asked. He sat in the other chair. They looked at the stars, which were impressive as they always were out here away from the light of town. "You have been going to Caldwell a great deal," Rodrigo said. "I have needed things," Charles said. "Yes," Rodrigo said, in a tone that suggested he found this explanation interesting but not entirely convincing. They drank their coffee in silence for a while. "There is a woman," Charles said. He had not planned to say it. It came out the way things come out when you have been holding them alone for too long, simply falling out of you when you least expect it. Rodrigo made a sound that was not quite a word. It was the sound of a man confirming something he already knew. "She works at Briggs's store," Charles said. "She is a bookkeeper. She came from Abilene. She is," he paused, and the word he found surprised him, "direct. She says what she means." "Margaret was direct," Rodrigo said quietly. Charles was quiet for a long time. An owl called somewhere in the dark pasture. The cattle shifted. The stars moved in their slow, indifferent arcs. "I know," Charles said. "It is not a betrayal," Rodrigo said. He said it simply and without particular emphasis, the way a man states something he considers obvious and self-evident, because Rodrigo had lived long enough to know that the heart is not a limited resource, that loving another person does not diminish what has come before. "Margaret would have told you that herself." "She would have," Charles said. "She would have said it in considerably more words and with considerably more directness than you just did." Rodrigo smiled, which was rare enough to be notable. "Then go to Caldwell," he said, "and stop pretending it is for salt and nails." The following Saturday Charles rode into Caldwell at 10 in the morning, which was an entirely different hour than his usual pre-dawn arrivals, and he went directly to the Briggs Mercantile. And when Eudora looked up from her ledger he said, before he could stop himself, "Would you like to see the town? I mean properly. I could walk with you." She looked at him for a moment with those clear brown eyes. "I have lived here for 6 weeks," she said. "I know the town fairly well by now." He felt the heat of embarrassment. "Yes," he said, "of course you do. But," she said, setting down her pen, "I have not had anyone to walk with, and it is a Saturday, and Mr. Briggs has given me the afternoon, so yes. I would like that very much." They walked Caldwell's Main Street from end to end and back again. They walked past the Lone Star Saloon, which was already doing business in the optimistic way of frontier saloons, and past the blacksmith's shop where a man named Connolly was shoeing horses with the precise, powerful efficiency of someone who has done the same thing 10,000 times. They walked past the small white building that served as both the post office and the district judge's office on alternate days, and past the livery stable, and past the rooming house where Eudora had her room, a small but clean space on the second floor that she described without complaint as better than she had expected and more expensive than she would have preferred. She talked about Abilene, which she had left because there was no advancement there for a woman doing accounts, only the same $40 a month forever with no prospect of more. She had been born in Indiana, she said, had come west with her parents in 1863 when she was 15, had grown up in Abilene, had learned bookkeeping from her father who had run a dry goods store, and had insisted that all his children, daughters included, understand how money worked. Her father had died in 1874. Her mother had gone to live with her brother's family in Denver. Eudora had stayed in Abilene because she had work and because she was 26 years old and was not prepared to be anyone's dependent. "You are 30, Charles said, calculating. "Yes," she said without embarrassment. "Does that concern you?" "No," he said. "I am 35. Then we are both of an age where we have stopped being surprised by much, she said. He thought about this and found it accurate. He had stopped being surprised by things. He had stopped expecting the future to hold particular gifts. He had stopped planning for anything beyond the next season, the next fence line, the next shipment of cattle to the market at the railhead. They stopped at the well where they had first spoken. The town around them was busy with Saturday activity, ranchers in from the surrounding country, a few cattle hands spending their week's pay with the cheerful recklessness of young men who have no possessions worth worrying about, a couple of women from the ladies' society walking briskly toward the church hall. The well sat in its usual place, solid and stone-walled and patient. Eudora looked at it. "This is where you were," she said, "when I arrived." "Yes," he said. "You really were trying not to be seen," she said. "I hope you understand that I did not say it to be unkind. It was simply the first thing that came to mind, and I have a weakness for saying the first true thing that comes to mind, which has caused me a number of problems over the years." "It was not unkind," Charles said. "It was accurate." She looked at him. "Why were you trying not to be seen?" He was quiet for a long time. A wagon creaked past. Somewhere a dog barked at something. The sky was very blue, the thin, clear blue of a Kansas October afternoon. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said. It was the first time he had said those words to a woman since the words had become true. To Rodrigo twice. To the circuit judge who had handled the estate matters, but never to a woman. His voice was steadier than he expected, which surprised him. "Typhoid, I have not." He stopped, and then he made himself continue because he had started it and it felt important to finish. "I have been alone since then. I preferred it. It was simpler." Eudora was quiet too. She was looking at the well, not at him, and he was grateful for that. It was easier to say difficult things when no one was watching your face. "I am sorry," she said. And she said it without the reflexive, performative sympathy that he had come to dread from people who said it as a social form, rather than a human response. She said it the way she said most things, directly, simply, without decoration. "What was her name?" "Margaret," he said. "Margaret Ford," she said quietly, as if she were giving the name the space it deserved. They stood at the well for a while after that, not speaking, not needing to, the comfortable silence of two people who have just said something real to each other and are letting it settle. Eventually she said, "I think you have been carrying that alone for a long time." "I have," he said. "That is an enormous amount of weight for 7 miles of Kansas prairie," she said, and it was the right thing to say, neither dismissing the weight nor collapsing under the sympathy of it. And he turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him, and her eyes were warm in the afternoon light. He walked her back to the rooming house at the end of the afternoon. At the door she stopped and turned and said, "Thank you for the walk, Mr. Ford." "Charles," he said, "please." She considered this, and something shifted in her expression, something gentle and careful. "Charles," she said. He rode home in the October dusk with the sky going purple and orange above the flat land and Copperhead moving steady beneath him. And for the first time in 3 years and 7 months he was thinking about the future. Not the next season, not the next fence line. The future in the larger sense, the sense in which it contains other people. It frightened him considerably. He came back the following Saturday with no pretense at all, no salt or nails or wire. He simply came. Eudora was at her desk when he walked in, and she looked up and said, "Hello, Charles." And he took off his hat and said, "Good morning, Eudora," and Horatio Briggs made a great show of needing to count something in the back storeroom. This became a pattern. Saturday mornings in town. Walks. Conversation that moved from practical to personal in the gradual, cautious way of two people who have both learned that opening up to someone carries real risk. She told him about growing up in Indiana before the war, about her father's stories of the land further west, about the way she had felt the first time she saw the Kansas plains, the specific combination of terror and exhilaration that comes from standing in a landscape so large that it renders you properly small. He told her about Missouri, about his father's farm, about why he had decided to come west with Margaret. He talked about Margaret more than he expected to, more than he thought he could. Each mention of her name was a small test, a checking of the wound, and each time the wound held, contained, real but no longer overwhelming. Eudora never flinched from the mention of Margaret. She listened with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, as if the history of the person across from her was something worth understanding rather than something to be politely ignored. In November, the weather turned serious. The Kansas winters were not gentle. The plains wind came down from the north without any hills or trees to break its passage, and it hit the town of Caldwell with the full conviction of something that has been building speed for 1,000 miles. Charles began worrying about the cattle in the lower pasture, and about the north section of fence, and about getting enough hay in before the hard frost, and for 2 weeks he did not come to town. He wrote Eudora a letter. He was startled to find himself writing it. He had not written a personal letter to anyone in years. He sat at the table in his kitchen on a cold November night with Rodrigo gone to his bunkhouse and the wind pushing at the windows, and he wrote 3 drafts of a letter that was, in all 3 drafts, essentially the same letter, which said that he was kept to the ranch by the winter preparations, but that he hoped she was keeping warm and that business at Briggs's was well, and that he looked forward to seeing her when the weather permitted. He sent the 3rd draft, which was in his cleanest handwriting and had only 1 crossed-out word. She wrote back in 4 days. She wrote in a clear, economical hand that matched her speech, direct and warm and specific. She told him that Caldwell was adjusting to winter with varying degrees of grace, that the saloons were doing exceptional business because the cold drove people indoors toward warm whiskey, that she had discovered a cat in the alleyway beside the rooming house that she had been feeding scraps, and that had now taken to sleeping outside her window on the roof of the porch, a development she described as entirely the cat's own idea and nothing she had encouraged. She said she missed the walks. He read the letter 4 times before folding it and placing it in the drawer of his bedside table, which was where he kept the things that mattered. He went to Caldwell the first Saturday in December when the weather broke enough to make the ride reasonable. She was at the Mercantile. She was wearing a heavier dress against the cold, deep green wool, and her hair was arranged slightly differently, or perhaps it was just the light, and when she looked up and saw him, something moved across her face that was quick and unguarded, a brightness, a relief, and he felt it in his chest like a hand pressed briefly over his heart. "You made it," she said. "The weather cooperated," he said. "I received your letter," she said. "I received yours," he said. They smiled at each other, and it was such a simple thing, a man and a woman smiling in a Mercantile in Caldwell, Kansas in December of 1878, and yet it felt to Charles like something profound was happening, like the earth was, very slowly and very quietly, reorienting itself. He had planned to stay for the morning and ride back before noon. He stayed until sunset, helping Eudora carry a heavy set of account books she had reorganized to a new filing cabinet Horatio had installed, then walking with her to the small restaurant near the post office where the owner, a Czech woman named Mrs. Bennett, served simple hot food at reasonable prices. They ate beef stew and bread and drank coffee, and the conversation moved through topics with ease. Books they had read, the statehood politics that were shaping Kansas, the particular character of Caldwell compared to other cattle towns they had known, the injustice of the way the Osage and the Cherokee to the south were being pushed off their treaty lands by cattlemen and government agents who treated paper agreements as suggestions rather than promises. A subject on which Eudora had strong opinions that she expressed without apology. "It is wrong," she said simply. "The law should mean the same thing for everyone. The treaty says the land is theirs, and the treaty should be honored." "It will not be," Charles said, not because he disagreed with her but because he knew the West well enough to know what was coming. "No," she said, "but that does not make it right, and I do not intend to pretend otherwise simply because the wrongdoing is convenient for people who look like me." He looked at her across the small table in Mrs. Beniz's restaurant with the lamplight between them and the wind outside, and he thought that he had not met a person quite like Eudora Thatcher in a very long time, possibly ever, certainly not since Margaret, and the thought did not hurt the way he had expected it to. It felt like something else, something gentler. He rode home that night in the dark with Copperhead picking his careful way along the trail, and the stars very bright and the temperature dropping. He was cold before he was halfway home, and he did not mind at all. Christmas came to Caldwell with all the slightly manic energy of a frontier town trying to impose civilization on wilderness. There were garlands of evergreen on the storefronts that had been brought up by wagon from further south. The church had a modest nativity scene that someone had carved. The Lone Star Saloon had strung colored ribbons around its sign. Mrs. Benez had made something that she called Christmas cake, and that was sweet and dense and excellent. Charles had not celebrated Christmas with any seriousness since 1875. He had spent the last 3 Christmases with Rodrigo, who was quietly Catholic, and who marked the holiday with a small candle and a prayer but no expectation of festivity. Charles had appreciated Rodrigo's lack of festivity about it. He had not wanted festivity. This year he rode into Caldwell on Christmas Eve, and he brought with him, tucked into his saddlebag, a gift he had purchased from a traveling merchant who had passed through in October, and whose wares he had at the time passed over but had thought about afterward, and then sent a letter to order. A small leather-bound book of poetry, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass in a pocket edition, which felt presumptuous, and he almost did not bring it, and then he did. He found Eudora at the Mercantile, helping Horatio with a display of Christmas goods near the front window. She was wearing a red ribbon in her hair which he had not seen before, and the sight of it did something warm and immediate to his internal architecture. "Merry Christmas, Charles," she said. "Merry Christmas," he said, and he took off his hat and he held it in both hands and he said, "I brought you something. It is not," he paused, trying to calibrate, "it is simply something I thought you would like, not an obligation in any way." She looked at him with the patient warmth she had developed in the 2 months since October, the look of someone who has learned to see this particular man through his habitual understatement. "May I see it?" He gave her the book. She looked at the cover. She looked up at him. Something in her expression did the thing that her expressions sometimes did, the thing where they moved through several layers too quickly for him to catalog all of them. "I love this book," she said. "I had a copy in Abilene, but I could not bring it. The bag was already too heavy." "I know," he said. "You told me in October at the well. You mentioned it." She stared at him. "I mentioned it once." "You mentioned it once," he confirmed. She held the book against her chest with both arms, and she looked at him and said nothing for a long moment. And in the warm silence of Horatio Briggs's Mercantile on Christmas Eve in 1878, Charles Ford understood for the first time with complete clarity that what he felt for Eudora Thatcher was love, not the cautious fondness of a man testing himself, not the gilt-edged admiration of someone recovering from grief, but the real thing, the same thing he had felt for Margaret. Not lesser and not the same, but of the same quality, as real and as certain as the weight of a well-made fence post in your hands. He was terrified by this. He wished her Merry Christmas again, and he went home, and he sat in his kitchen with a cup of coffee, and he stared at the wall for the better part of an hour while Rodrigo went to his bunkhouse after leaving a plate of food that Charles ate without tasting. He had to do something with this. He had to either step forward or step back. Half-presence was not fair to either of them. He had been raised to understand that you do not give a person reason to expect something unless you intend to follow through, and 3 months of Saturday visits and letters and walks and Christmas Eve books had given Eudora Thatcher reason to expect something, had they not? He thought they had. He would have to be very certain. He spent Christmas Day at the ranch, alone except for Rodrigo, and he thought about what he wanted his life to look like. Really thought about it, the way he had not been willing to think about it since Margaret died, because thinking about it had felt like a betrayal then, and it did not feel like a betrayal now, and that change itself was significant. He thought about the ranch, about the house that had 4 rooms and was large enough for more than one person but had been housing only one. He thought about quiet evenings that were quiet in the wrong way, the absent way, rather than the chosen way. He thought about sitting at Mrs. Benez's table across from Eudora with the lamplight between them. He thought about Eudora asking the question at the well, "You look like a man who is trying very hard not to be seen," and how it had opened something in him that had not been open in years, and how everything that had followed had felt like the careful reopening of a door he had believed permanently closed. He went to Caldwell on the 27th of December, which was a Friday, and he went directly to the rooming house, and he asked the landlady, a stout Scottish woman named Mrs. Abernethy, to tell Miss Thatcher that Mr. Ford was waiting in the front parlor if she had a few minutes. He waited in the front parlor, which had a small fire going and 2 chairs that had seen considerable use, and after 5 minutes Eudora came downstairs in her everyday dark blue dress with her hair down, which he had not seen before, and she was clearly surprised to see him on a Friday and at the rooming house rather than the mercantile, and she said, "Charles, is something wrong?" "No," he said. "No, nothing is wrong. I simply—" He stood up because he could not sit still, and he held his hat in his hands, and he said, "I need to say something to you, and I think I need to say it where we are not in Briggs's mercantile with Horatio in the back room pretending to count things." She sat in one of the parlor chairs. Her eyes were very steady on him. She was not going to help him through this. She was going to let him say it himself. He understood, in the way he had come to understand her, that this was kindness rather than withholding, that she thought it mattered that he say it clearly. "I have not been able to think about much besides you since October," he said. "I have not felt that way about anyone since Margaret. I did not think I would again, and I had decided I was comfortable with that, but I was wrong about being comfortable with it. I was simply accustomed to it, which is different. And since you arrived at that well in September and said exactly what you observed without decoration or apology, I have been, he searched for the word and found it, returning to myself. And I wanted you to know that. And I wanted to ask you," he took a breath, "whether any of this is mutual. And you should tell me honestly if it is not, because I am capable of accepting an honest answer." Eudora Thatcher looked at him from the parlor chair with the firelight on her face and her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and she said, "Charles Ford, I have been in love with you since you remembered that I mentioned that book once and then quietly went out of your way to get it for me." He stared at her. She raised her eyebrows slightly. "That is considerably more evidence than most men think to provide," she said. "I am not most men," he said, and it sounded arrogant, and he knew immediately it sounded arrogant, and he said, "I mean only that I pay attention to the things people tell me." "I know what you meant," she said, and she stood up and crossed the small space between the chairs and stopped in front of him. She was not short. She came up to his collarbone, and she looked up at him with that directness that had stopped him at the well and had kept stopping him ever since. "I am also in love with you," she said, clearly, the way she said things she wanted heard without ambiguity, in case the previous statement was too oblique. He put his hands on her face gently, as if he were holding something that had been irreplaceable once and had unexpectedly been returned to him, and he kissed her, and it was a very simple and very certain kiss, and when it ended she had both her hands on his chest and her forehead against his jaw, and they stood that way in Mrs. Abernethy's parlor while the fire crackled. "What do we do now?" he said into her hair. "I have some ideas," she said, "but I would like to hear yours first." The winter of 1878 into 1879 was hard on the Kansas plains, as Kansas winters usually were, but it had a warmth to it that year for Charles Ford that he had not anticipated, and would not have been able to explain to anyone who had not experienced the particular warmth of loving someone after a long cold. He and Eudora saw each other every Saturday and some Sundays. When the trail was too icy to ride, they wrote letters, long letters now, letters that went back and forth with increasing frequency, carried by the male rider who made the circuit between Caldwell and the outlying ranches. He brought her out to the ranch for the first time in January on a Sunday when Rodrigo had cleaned the kitchen to a state it had not been in since Margaret's time, a fact Charles pretended not to notice and was deeply moved by. Eudora looked at the house with the careful, interested gaze she brought to everything, and she complimented the well which Charles had built himself and which was indeed exceptional, and she stood at the kitchen window looking out over the south pasture in the white winter light and said, "This is a good place." "It has been lonely," he said. "Yes," she said, "but that is because you are here alone, not because of the place itself." She met Rodrigo over coffee at the kitchen table. Rodrigo was formal with her in the way of a man who has seen his employer hurt and is reserving full judgment, but he was also polite in the way of a man who was raised right. And by the end of the coffee, he was telling her about the spring flooding in the north pasture with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting for an interested listener. Eudora asked 2 questions about the drainage, and Rodrigo looked at Charles with an expression that said, plainly, that he had reconsidered and was satisfied. In February, Charles asked her to marry him. He did it at the well where they had met, which felt important to him in a way that was not sentimental but structural, as if beginning and beginning again at the same place created a coherence to things. He had brought 2 cups of coffee from Mrs. Benez's restaurant because the well in February was cold and he was practical about these things, and he held both cups while Eudora laughed at the impracticality of the whole arrangement, and then he set the cups on the stone lip of the well and he said, "I want to ask you something and I want to ask it here." She looked at him. "Then ask it," she said. "Marry me," he said. He had rehearsed a longer speech and had discarded all of it. "I love you and I want to build a life with you on the ranch, and I want you to be there in the morning and in the evening, and I want to stop writing letters and start having actual conversations in the same room. Marry me, Eudora." She picked up her coffee cup. She looked at the well. She looked at the town around her, quiet in the cold morning. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." They were married in the first week of April of 1879, in the small white church in Caldwell, by the circuit minister who came through every 2 months, and who was a cheerful, pragmatic man named Reverend Calloway, who conducted weddings, funerals, and baptisms with equal efficiency and genuine warmth. Horatio Briggs was there, beaming as if he had personally arranged the whole thing, which he had not but felt entitled to some credit for given that he had hired Eudora in the first place. Mrs. Abernethy came and cried in the way of Scottish landladies at romantic occasions. Rodrigo stood to Charles's left and wore a clean shirt and shook hands with everyone who approached him. Mrs. Benez brought a cake. Eudora wore a dress the color of the early spring prairie, a pale gold that seemed to collect the light, and she walked to Charles through the small crowded church with her chin up and her eyes clear and her hands steady, and he watched her come to him and felt the rightness of it settle through him like water finding its level. The minister said the words and they said their words, and at the end when he said they were married the small congregation made a satisfying amount of noise, and Eudora looked up at Charles with a brightness in her eyes that was not quite tears and not quite laughter but was somewhere in the territory between them, and he took her hand and held it and was not afraid. Eudora moved out of the rooming house and out to the ranch on a warm April morning with Copperhead pulling a borrowed wagon containing her books, her ledger supplies, her practical ladle, and 2 boxes of clothing. Rodrigo had cleaned the house again. He had also, without being asked, put wildflowers from the edge of the south pasture in a jar on the kitchen table, which was either sentimentality from a man who claimed none or a pragmatic understanding of what women liked. Either way, when Eudora saw them, she put her hand on Rodrigo's arm and thanked him with a directness and warmth that made the old man stand slightly straighter. She arranged her things in the bedroom and in the small room adjacent to the kitchen that she declared would be her office, because she had plans. She had negotiated with Horatio before the wedding. She would continue to keep his accounts 3 days a week but from home, riding in on Tuesdays and Thursdays and one other day as needed, and collecting and returning ledgers by arrangement. She was also, she told Charles over their first supper at the ranch, interested in keeping the ranch accounts properly because, from what she could see, Charles's system of ranch management, while functional, was not optimized. "It is not optimized," he agreed. "I have some thoughts," she said. He looked at her across the table, this woman who had appeared at his well in September and had said 4 words that had cracked him open, and he felt a fullness in his chest that was simply happiness, uncomplicated and complete. "I would like to hear them," he said. The spring of 1879 was good to the ranch. The flooding in the North Pasture was less severe than in previous years. Due in part to some drainage work Rodrigo and Charles had done over the winter, based partly on suggestions from Eudora, based on her conversation with Rodrigo in January. A fact that Charles found deeply pleasing as evidence that the people he loved were beginning to work together as a kind of team. Cattle were healthy. The spring calves arrived with good numbers. The south pasture grass was excellent. Eudora rode out with Charles some mornings to check the pastures, learning the land with the same methodical attention she brought to a ledger, asking questions, listening to answers, building a map of the place in her mind. She was not a rancher by training, but she was intelligent, and she was practical, and she was stubborn in the best possible way, the way that means a person will keep trying until they understand. By May she could read the condition of the grass as well as a woman who had been ranching for years, and by June she was occasionally the one who spotted a section of fence that needed attention before Charles did. They had the kind of marriage Charles had not known he was hoping for, which was the marriage of 2 people who are fully themselves in each other's company. He had worried in the weeks before the wedding that he had lost the ability to be in intimate daily proximity to another person, that 3 years of solitude had hardened him into a shape that did not accommodate another's presence. He was wrong. He had not been hardened. He had been waiting, though he had not known he was waiting, and Eudora's presence in the house and in the mornings and across the supper table every evening did not feel like an imposition or an adjustment. It felt like the restoration of something that had always been supposed to be there. They talked every evening, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer, in the way of people who are genuinely interested in each other's minds. She told him about the books she was reading. He told her about the cattle market, about what the other ranchers were seeing with the trail drives, about the changing economics of the cattle industry as the railroads pushed further, and the trail drives began to be replaced by local railheads. She had opinions about all of it, sound opinions based on the books and the newspapers she read and the information that flowed through Briggs's Mercantile like water through a watershed. He began to trust her judgment in a way that he had not trusted any judgment but his own in years, and he found this, to his considerable surprise, not threatening but relieving. He told her about Margaret in pieces, over months, the way you tell someone about a thing that mattered very much when you are confident they understand the weight of what you are telling them. He told her about Missouri and about the early years in Kansas and about the house building and about the last autumn when Margaret had gotten sick and how quickly it had gone wrong and how there had been nothing to be done. Eudora listened to all of it. She did not tell him to feel better or to look on the bright side. She asked good questions, and she said once, after a particularly difficult telling, "She sounds like she was extraordinary." "She was," Charles said. "I am glad you had her," Eudora said, "and I am glad you found a way through. I want you to know that you are allowed to have had her and to have me, Charles. Those things do not compete with each other." He looked at her and he said, "I know that, I know it now." And then he said, "I did not know it in September." "I know," she said. "I could tell." What could you tell from the well? She thought about this. That you were a man who had loved someone deeply and had lost her and was not sure the world had anything further to offer him, and that you were wrong about that, but you could not see it yet. And you thought, from the well, in 4 words, that you could change that. She smiled, the real smile, the one he had been seeing for 6 months now, the one that transformed her face from direct and serious to something entirely luminous. "I thought it was worth finding out," she said. In the summer of 1879, Charles began to expand the ranch. Eudora's account management had shown him where money was being wasted and where opportunities were being missed, and he had savings enough to purchase an additional 40 acres to the east that the neighboring Haverson Ranch was selling off after old Haverson retired to live with his daughter in Topeka. Rodrigo hired 2 additional hands, young men from Wichita who were good with cattle, and who treated both Charles and Eudora with the straightforward respect of men who have found a fair employer and intend to keep the position. The ranch became a working concern in a fuller sense than it had been in years. Caldwell itself was changing. The cattle drives were beginning their decline as the Kansas legislature pushed the quarantine lines further south, trying to keep Texas cattle that might carry tick fever away from the domestic Kansas herds. It was a source of significant tension in the region, ranchers against farmers, cattlemen against the railroad interests, the old open-range ways of doing business rubbing hard against the fencing and the property lines of the new order. Charles navigated this with his characteristic quietness, keeping his head down, building his own operation, staying out of disputes that were not his to fight. Eudora did not always think it was possible or right to stay out of everything. In August, she attended a meeting at the church hall regarding the reorganization of Caldwell's school district, which had been conducted in a way that systematically disadvantaged the Mexican families on the south end of town. Families like Rodrigo's distant cousins, who had been in the territory longer than most of the town's Anglo residents, but whose children were being rooted into an inferior schooling arrangement. She stood up at that meeting and she said what she thought, which was that equal education was a matter of basic justice, and that the school board's current proposal was not equal, and everyone in the room who had been to school knew the difference between adequate and inadequate. There was considerable grumbling. There was one man who told her she did not understand how things worked in Kansas. There was another who suggested that a woman ought to leave the school board matters to those with authority over such things. Eudora listened to both of these men and then said, in a level voice that carried to the back of the room, that she understood perfectly how things worked in Kansas, and that understanding how things worked was not the same as believing they should continue to work that way. Charles, sitting beside her, said nothing. He did not need to say anything. He was there, and his presence was not neutral, because he was known as a fair man whose opinion mattered. And when the school board looked at him at the end of the meeting, he said, simply, "My wife is right." And that was sufficient for several men in the room to reconsider their positions, which was not perfect justice, but was more than nothing. The school district reorganization was amended 3 months later, a partial concession that was not everything Eudora had asked for, but was meaningfully better than what had been proposed. She accepted it as a step rather than a conclusion, and wrote a letter to the county commissioner outlining what the next steps should be. In October of 1879, 1 year after that first walk through Caldwell, Charles came home from checking the east fence line to find Eudora standing at the kitchen window with an expression he had not seen on her before, a slightly soft and inward-looking expression, as if she were thinking about something very carefully. He came in and took off his coat and washed at the basin, and when he turned she was still looking at the window. "Eudora," he said. She turned, the expression resolved into the directness he knew. "I think I am pregnant," she said. He stood still. "I am not certain yet," she said, "but the signs are consistent. I would say perhaps 7 or 8 weeks. He walked to her. He put his hands on her shoulders. He looked at her face and he said, "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I am not frightened, if that is what you are asking." "I am," she considered, "astonished, though I do not know why I should be. The biology is perfectly straightforward." He laughed. This time the laugh actually happened, full and real and warm in the kitchen. She looked at him with her eyebrows raised and her lips pressed together against her own smile, and he pulled her to him and held her there with his face against her hair. "I am very happy," he said. "So am I," she said into his shoulder. "Very, very happy, also astonished. both things simultaneously. Rodrigo, when he was told, shook Charles's hand with a grip that expressed considerably more emotion than his face did. And then he shook Eudora's hand too, and told her that he would make sure the well water was clean all winter, and that she was not to lift the heavy feed bags without asking him first. "Rodrigo," Eudora said, "you are a good man." He looked briefly as if this had landed somewhere tender, and then he straightened his hat and said he had work to do and went back out to the barn, and Charles watched him go with affection and gratitude. The winter of 1879 was cold but contained. The ranch was warm, the firewood was well stocked, the cattle were in good shape, and Eudora continued to ride to Caldwell twice a week to manage the accounts at Briggs's until December, when the condition of the trails in winter made it impractical. She had by then set up a sufficiently robust system that Horatio's nephew could manage the day-to-day entries, and she would review and reconcile remotely, which was an arrangement that Horatio accepted with the relief of a man who had unexpectedly received a gift. She had also begun, quietly, keeping accounts for 2 other businesses in town, correspondence work that she conducted from her office off the kitchen, because Eudora Thatcher Ford was not a woman who was comfortable with idle hands. The baby came in June of 1880, on a morning when the south pasture was so green it looked unreal, and the sky was the deep clear blue of high summer. The local midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Pierce, who had brought most of the babies in the Caldwell vicinity into the world for the past 15 years, arrived in the early morning and stayed until noon. Charles was in the kitchen, which was where he had been firmly redirected after his first attempt to remain near the bedroom had been assessed by both Mrs. Pierce and Eudora as counterproductive. He sat at the kitchen table with Rodrigo. They drank coffee. They did not speak much. When the baby cried for the first time, which was a sound unlike any other sound Charles had ever heard in his life, both men sat perfectly still, and then Rodrigo crossed himself, and Charles put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. Mrs. Pierce came to the kitchen door and said, "A boy, both healthy. Your wife is asking for you." The boy was named William after Charles's father and Thomas after Eudora's, William Thomas Ford, a name that Eudora said while holding the baby in the bedroom with the morning light coming through the window had enough weight to it to anchor someone in the world. He was small and red and furious looking, and when Charles held him for the first time he felt something shift in him that had nothing to do with grief or its absence, and everything to do with the extraordinary, humbling fact that life continues and continues and continues. Eudora looked up at him from the pillows with tired eyes and a smile that was the most unguarded expression he had ever seen on her face. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed, holding his son. "He looks like he has opinions," she said. "He is your son," Charles said. "Of course he has opinions." She laughed, which exhausted her, and he sat beside her with the baby and she fell asleep, and he sat there for a long time in the morning light watching them both breathe. William Thomas Ford proved to be an exceptional baby in the specific sense that he was extremely healthy and had, as predicted, strong opinions about meals and sleep schedules and the general conduct of the adults around him. He was dark-haired like his mother and had his father's gray eyes and a temperament that Mrs. Pierce, who saw him every few months, described as very determined, which was a medical assessment that Charles considered accurate. Eudora returned to full work capacity by August, which was earlier than Mrs. Pierce recommended and later than Eudora preferred, a compromise that Charles had negotiated between them with the diplomatic skill of a man who was afraid of both women, but did not intend to show it. Rodrigo proved unexpectedly gifted at holding the baby, while Eudora worked in her office, sitting in the kitchen chair with the infant on his knee, with the focused patience of a man accustomed to managing things considerably more difficult than a baby. The ranch continued to grow. By the fall of 1880 they had 420 acres, a solid herd, a bunkhouse that now housed 3 hands in addition to Rodrigo, and an account system that Eudora had refined to a precision that Charles described to neighboring ranchers, when they asked, as remarkable, which was an understatement in the same category as calling the Kansas wind a bit breezy. 2 other ranchers in the county hired Eudora to review their account systems on a consulting basis, and she did this from the ranch in correspondence, which generated income that she reinvested partly into ranch improvements and partly into a small savings account she had opened in her own name at the Caldwell Bank, because Eudora Thatcher Ford had not arrived at 31 with financial independence only to abandon the principle of it upon marriage. Charles loved her for this. He loved her for this specific practical principle, and for everything else that made up the architecture of her character: the directness, the intelligence, the warmth that lived underneath the practicality and emerged at the moments when he needed it most, and the way she had from the beginning treated him as a complete person rather than a project to be fixed or a wound to be handled. He told her this on the evening of their 2nd anniversary, the 1st of April of 1881, sitting on the porch in the early spring evening with William asleep in the house and Rodrigo's lamp on in the bunkhouse, and the south pasture looking extraordinary in the last light. He told her the way he had learned to tell her things, without rehearsal, directly, in his own rough voice that had been quiet for so long, and had found itself again in October of 1878 at a stone well before breakfast. "I want you to know," he said, "that I am happy. I want to say it plainly. I am not a man who has found it easy to say such things, but you have made it considerably easier, and I think you deserve to hear it spoken rather than simply demonstrated." She turned to look at him from her chair with that expression, the one that was warmth and steadiness, and something else he had come to understand was her particular variety of love, which was not effusive or decorative but was thorough and real and could be relied upon completely. "I know you are happy," she said. "I can tell." "I know you can tell," he said, "but I wanted to say it." "I am happy too," she said. "Entirely and specifically happy. I want you to know that also." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat on the porch, while the light failed over the south pasture, and the first stars appeared above the flat land, and Copperhead moved quietly in the paddock near the barn, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called, and the prairie answered in its deep, wordless way. By the spring of 1882, Caldwell had changed considerably from the cattle town Charles had first ridden into with Margaret in 1871. The Kishom Trail drives were thinning, as the quarantine laws pushed the Texas cattle trade to alternate routes further west. The town was transitioning from a pure cattle economy to a more mixed one, farming operations moving in from the east, new businesses opening to serve a more settled population. The Lone Star Saloon was still in business, but its clientele was quieter than it had been in the rowdy peak years when cowboys fresh off the trail spent a season's earnings in a night. Caldwell was becoming, in the inevitable way of frontier towns that survive their frontier period, a real town. Horatio Briggs expanded the mercantile and hired Eudora's ledger system out to 3 additional merchants on the main street as a service, paying her a portion of the arrangement fees, which she accepted as the fair recognition of intellectual property that it was. She had by this point also taken on the role of informal financial advisor to several women in the county who found themselves managing household finances without adequate support or knowledge, conducting informal sessions at Mrs. Benez's restaurant on Tuesday afternoons that had begun as a single conversation with a neighbor's wife, and had expanded to a standing group of 8 or 9 women who compared notes on crop prices, credit terms, and the economic realities of frontier homesteading. Charles went with her to Mrs. Benez's one Tuesday, not to participate but to see, and what he saw was Eudora at the center of a table of women, talking with the precise, warm authority of someone who has understood that information is power, and that sharing power is not a loss but an expansion. And he thought, not for the first time, that the mail wagon that had broken its axle 40 miles outside of Caldwell in September of 1878 had done him, and possibly the county, an enormous favor. Their second child came in the late summer of 1882, a girl this time, born with a remarkable quantity of dark hair and an expression that Rodrigo declared, holding her with the confidence of a man who had been practicing for 2 years, indicated a very definite personality. They named her Clara Margaret, the Margaret for the woman Charles had loved first and whom he wanted remembered in his life rather than erased from it. Because Eudora had suggested it. Because Eudora understood without needing it, explained that a life is not a series of replacements but an accumulation, that the people you have loved remain a part of who you are, and that honoring them is not diminishment of the present but an acknowledgement of the full truth. When he heard the name suggested, he had looked at Eudora across the bedroom where she held the newborn, and he had not been able to speak for a moment, and she had looked back at him with perfect steadiness and said, "She was part of making you who you are, Charles. Our children should know that." He sat beside her on the bed and he put his hand over hers where it cradled the baby and he said, "I love you with my whole heart." "I know," she said. "I love you with mine." Clara Margaret Ford was from her earliest days precisely, as Rodrigo had diagnosed, a person of very definite personality. She was loud and curious and physical in a way that William, who was methodical and quiet like his father, was not. She walked early and talked earlier, and by 18 months had opinions about the arrangement of objects in the kitchen that she expressed without ambiguity. Charles watched her with a kind of delighted wonder, and Eudora watched her with the expression of someone observing a phenomenon that is not entirely a surprise. "She is very like you," Charles said one evening. "Yes," Eudora said, without particular modesty. "She is." The ranch in the summer of 1883 was everything Charles had built toward in the years since he had first broken ground in 1871. The house was larger now, an addition he and Rodrigo and the Hands had put on in the winter of 1881, a sitting room and an additional bedroom and a proper porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The accounts were excellent. The herd was strong. The land was good. Rodrigo had begun to slow slightly, as men his age will, and Charles had adjusted his responsibilities accordingly without discussion, the two of them managing it with the wordless understanding of men who have worked together for a long time. On a September morning in 1883, exactly 5 years after Eudora had appeared at the well in Caldwell, Charles rode into town for flour and salt and coffee, because those needs had not changed in 35 years of life and were not likely to change now. He stopped at the well on his way past, out of habit and out of something more deliberate, a kind of gratitude that he did not have fully adequate words for but that he expressed privately in the act of stopping. The town was busy with the late summer activity of a working Kansas community. Wagons moved along the street. Children ran past on some errand of their own. 2 men discussed something at the hitching post in front of the post office. It was a very ordinary morning, and also, from where Charles stood at the old stone well, a very extraordinary one. He thought about the man he had been in September of 1878, thin with a grief he had never spoken aloud, and a habit of silence that had hardened around him like caliche. He thought about Copperhead stopping at this well before sunrise and the bucket and the creak of the rope, and then the voice, low and settled and asking for water. "You look like a man who is trying very hard not to be seen." He pulled the well water up and drank from the ladle he carried, his own ladle, because he was a practical man and he had learned that from her. And he looked at the town around him, the town where his wife had her consulting work and her Tuesday group and her reputation as the most reliable accountant in the county, the town where he was known as a fair man who had a good ranch and a good marriage and 2 children who were going to grow up better than he had been because they would have both parents to learn from. He finished his water. He remounted Copperhead, who was patient as always, and he rode to the mercantile and completed his shopping and rode home. Eudora was at the kitchen table when he came in, working through a set of accounts for a client with Clara in the next room having her afternoon nap and William somewhere in the barn with Rodrigo learning to saddle a horse. She looked up when he came in with his flour and his salt and his coffee. She looked at him the way she had been looking at him for 5 years, with that clear warmth that saw him fully and held nothing of him against him. "You went to the well," she said. It was not a question. "I always stop," he said. "I know," she said. She set down her pen. "What were you thinking about?" He hung his coat on the peg by the door. He set the supplies on the kitchen table. He looked at her, this woman who had appeared in his life like rain after a very long drought and who had stayed and built and argued and loved with equal commitment to all of it. "About you," he said. "About the morning you arrived. About what 4 words did." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I did not plan to say it. I simply looked at you and it was the truest thing I could see." "I know," he said. "That is why it worked." She held out her hand and he crossed the kitchen and took it and stood there beside the table with her hand in his and the afternoon light coming through the window over the south pasture, the same window she had stood at when she first came to the ranch, and the sound of his son and his friend in the barn and his daughter sleeping and the land outside quiet and good. "I was so certain I was done," he said, "with all of it, with any of this." "I know," she said. "You wore it like a coat. And now?" She looked up at him, and her eyes were warm and direct and entirely his, entirely her own, entirely the eyes of the woman who had walked 40 miles on a broken-axle road and asked for water and told a silent man exactly what she saw in him before she knew his name. "Now," she said, "you wear your life instead." He sat down at the table beside her, and they were quiet together in the good kitchen of the good house on the good land they had built. And outside William laughed at something Rodrigo said. And inside Clara stirred in the next room and went back to sleep. And the coffee was on the stove, and the ledgers were open, and the light moved slowly across the floor, and the afternoon was long and full and theirs. 3 years later, in the autumn of 1886, Charles and Eudora welcomed a 3rd child into the family, another boy they named Henry Rodrigo Ford. The Rodrigo for the man who had been loyal and steady, and who had, the previous spring, finally retired to a small house in Caldwell that Charles had helped him purchase, a clean, well-situated house on the south end of town where Rodrigo kept a vegetable garden and received visits from Eudora and the children every Tuesday when she came to town for consulting work. He held baby Henry with the practiced ease of a man who had been practicing since William arrived and declared him perfect. William Ford at 7 was everything his father had quietly hoped a son could be, thoughtful and deliberate, interested in the land and the animals with a thoroughness that went beyond childhood fascination into genuine understanding. Charles spent whole mornings with him in the pastures, explaining what the grass told you about soil, and what the cattle's behavior told you about the grass. And William listened the way Charles had always wanted someone to listen, carefully and without hurry. Clara Ford at 4 was a force of nature. She had Eudora's directness and Charles's stubbornness, and an additional quality that seemed to be entirely her own, which was a specific fearlessness that expressed itself in climbing things that were too high and asking questions that were too direct, and announcing her conclusions before anyone had asked for them. Charles privately found this both exhausting and magnificent. Eudora found it entirely familiar. The Caldwell of 1886 was a calmer place than the cattle town of the 1870s. The wild years were behind it. The trail drives were effectively over, the quarantine lines having pushed the Texas cattle trade far enough west that Caldwell was no longer the end of the road for the great northern herds. What remained was a solid, working town with a school that now educated all the county's children under the same roof, a reform that had taken 6 years and Eudora's consistent advocacy, and the eventual practical recognition of the school board that it was simpler and cheaper to maintain one good school than 2 inadequate ones. Charles rode into town one morning, in October of 1886, Henry strapped to his front in the manner Eudora had devised from a description she had read in a pamphlet about carrying methods used by the Osage, which was practical and effective if somewhat surprising to the ranchers. He passed on the trail. who looked at a large, quiet man carrying a baby across his chest on horseback, with the expressions of people who have encountered something they were not prepared for. He was going for supplies and to drop Henry at Rodrigo's house for the morning while Eudora had her Tuesday session at Mrs. Beniz's restaurant, and he was going, also, to the well. He went to the well first, as he always did when he came in from the west. He stopped Copperhead and dismounted and stood at the stone lip of the well with Henry awake on his chest, making the observational sounds of a baby cataloging its world. He looked at the street around them, at the town that was ordinary and alive, and at the well that was just a well except for the fact that it was everything. He drew water. He drank. He gave Henry a small amount from his wet finger, which Henry received with the focused consideration of someone evaluating a new kind of information. He looked up and down the morning street and breathed the October air, which still had that quality he associated with Kansas autumns, that thin, clear, serious quality of air that has traveled a long way and knows something the air in other seasons does not. He thought about a morning 8 years ago, a man at a well before sunrise, pulling himself smaller with every dawn, trying to take up no space in the world so the world could not take anything further from him. He thought about how wrong he had been. He thought about Eudora walking out of the early light with a canvas bag and a practical ladle, and a sentence she had not planned to say. He thought that life was, whatever else it was, capable of astonishing you if you were willing to stand still long enough at the right well on the right morning. Henry made a sound of decided opinion about something, and Charles looked down at him and said, "Yes, I agree," and remounted, and rode the rest of the way into Caldwell. He left Henry with Rodrigo, who had the kettle on and the garden coming in, and went to get his supplies and his flour and coffee, and the nails he actually did need this time for the new gate on the east pasture. He was coming out of the mercantile, which Horatio had handed over to his nephew the previous year, and retired to the house behind it with a relief that was audible at 50 paces, when he saw Eudora coming out of Mrs. Beniz's restaurant with 2 of the women from her Tuesday group, all of them talking, Eudora in the center of the conversation with the focused, animated expression she wore when she was explaining something she found important. She saw him across the street, and the animated expression became, briefly, the other one, the personal one, the one that was only for him. She said something to the women and crossed the street. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. She looked at him in the October morning light, this man who had been her husband for 7 years and a half, who had given her a ranch and 3 children, and a life so much larger than the life she had been building carefully alone in Abilene, and she thought, as she thought most days, that the broken mail wagon and the 40 miles and the early morning thirst had been the best possible sequence of inconveniences that had ever happened to her. "How is Henry?" she asked. "Philosophical," Charles said. "He gets that from you," she said. "He gets the good things from you," he said. She reached up and straightened the collar of his coat, which had turned up on one side, with the easy, proprietary affection of a woman who has been doing small adjustments to a particular man for long enough that it has become as natural as breathing. "Meet me at the well before you ride back," she said. "I want to walk to Mrs. Pierce's and check on the new baby in the Johnson household, and I could use the company." "I will be there," he said. She went back to her group. He finished loading his supplies. He went to get Henry from Rodrigo's, who sent them off with a paper bag of squash from the garden, with the wordless generosity of a man who shows his love in practical currency. He settled Henry back in the carrier and rode to the well. She was there when he arrived, in her dark coat against the October air, her hat on, her bag over her shoulder, her expression the composed, ready one of a woman with a destination and no reason to dawdle. She looked up at him on Copperhead and at Henry peering over the edge of the carrier with his large observational eyes. "Ready," she said. "Always," he said. She fell into step beside the horse, and they moved through the morning town together, this woman and this man and their youngest child, along the street where they had first met, and where they had walked for the first time, and where they had returned, season after season, in the changing light of Kansas years. The well stood behind them as they went, patient and stone-walled and full of cold, clear water, keeping no record of what had been said at its lip and what had changed because of it. It simply stood as it had always stood, offering what wells offer to the people who come to them thirsty and find, sometimes, more than they came for. Charles Ford had come to it a man trying not to be seen, and had been seen anyway, and had found that being seen was not the loss he had feared but the beginning of everything. The town moved around them. The children of Caldwell ran their errands. The businesses opened their doors. The smoke from the kitchen fires went straight up in the still October air. The prairie beyond the last building spread away in every direction, vast and serious and holding, as it always had, the full complicated lives of the people who had chosen to call it home. Eudora reached up without looking and took his hand where it rested on Copperhead's neck, and he held it, and they walked on into the October morning and the years ahead of them that were still, God willing, long and full and good. Henry Ford observed all of this from his position on his father's chest, with the concentrated attention of someone who understands that he is watching something important even if he does not yet have the words for what it is. He would have them, in time. He came from people who always did.